Christians have killed more Christians than Rome ever did. Not close. For 300 years, the Roman Empire hunted them for their faith. Then, under Emperor Constantine, Christians got the power Rome once had, and they turned it on each other. This isn't just a story about early church persecution. It's about what happens when your side wins. 13 centuries of religious violence and theological heresy. One church killing its own people, generation after generation. And there's a moment in the middle of it, one line from one bishop, right before 7,000 people died inside a church they thought would protect them. Stay for that moment. It's the one this whole thing turns on. So for 300 years, Christians were the ones being hunted. They were imprisoned, executed, and frequently turned into a public spectacle. Rome basically saw early Christianity as this massive threat to order, a belief system that bluntly refused imperial worship and frankly was spreading way too fast to control. But in 313 AD, we see this massive structural shift begin. Christianity suddenly becomes completely legal under Constantine, and the persecution naturally starts to fade. Now, most popular histories kind of stop right there, but that isn't the end of the story, because in 380 AD, Emperor Theodosius takes it a massive step further. Christianity becomes the official state religion of the empire, and at that exact point, everything changes structurally. Because now, not just other religions, but other versions of Christianity itself become completely illegal. After 380 AD, the dynamic flips entirely. The persecuted suddenly have the full, terrifying force of the state right behind them. So what actually happens when belief suddenly gains state power? Well, the very first answer appears down in North Africa, with a movement led by Bishop Donatus. We call them the Donatists. And these were Christians in almost every conceivable sense of the word. They used the same scriptures, the same rituals, and held the exact same core faith. But they had one major disagreement with Rome. They basically believed that priests who had renounced their faith under Roman persecution permanently lost their religious authority. Rome strongly disagreed with that. Now, from our modern viewpoint, this just looks like a standard theological debate, right? But then Augustine of Hippo enters the picture. He's one of the most influential thinkers in all of history, and he does something entirely new. He argues that the state not only can use force against Christian dissent, it actually has the absolute duty to do so. And he anchors this entire doctrine on just 4 words from the book of Luke: compel them to come in. Read that way, it becomes a justification, a totally devastating precedent. The Donatists are suppressed, their churches are forcibly taken, and their leaders are exiled. At the time, it looks contained, but that precedent, it's set in stone for the next 1,000 years. Fast forward centuries later, over in southern France, and a movement called the Cathars begins to grow. Now, at first glance, they really aren't a threat to anybody. They live simply, they reject excess wealth, and they spend their time caring for the sick. But Rome? Rome sees heresy. They see a direct challenge to absolute authority. So by the time Pope Innocent III reacts, the response is absolute. In 1208, a crusade is called. But wait, it's not outward towards Jerusalem. It's an inward military campaign against Christians right there in Europe. Tens of thousands of soldiers are mobilized, and they are offered spiritual rewards equal to those fighting in the Holy Land. And this brilliantly illustrates the horrific extreme of what happens when beliefs simply cannot be separated from identity. In 1209, this crusade reaches the city of Béziers. It's a completely mixed city. You've got Catholics and Cathars living side by side, sometimes in the exact same families. So how do you separate them? Well, that question is taken to the papal legate, Arno Emmerich, and according to a chronicle written soon after, his answer was incredibly chilling. Kill them all. God will know his own. Now, whether those exact words were spoken is still debated by historians today, but what followed is undeniable fact. The city was completely sacked. Thousands of people died inside the very churches where they sought refuge. Estimates reach up to 20,000 dead in a single day. Think about that for a second. When the event is reported back to Rome, it is described as a victory, not a tragedy. There was zero distinction made. This single brutal event effectively birthed the Inquisition, a systemic apparatus designed not for outsiders, mind you, but to root out Christians who simply believed differently. And once a system like that exists, it waits, it spreads. So we jump to 1517, and Martin Luther's protests accidentally shatter this established structure entirely. He absolutely didn't intend to break the system. He actually thought he was repairing it. But thanks to the printing press, these ideas spread like wildfire, faster than anyone could possibly control. Suddenly, authority fractures. You have Lutherans, Calvinists, Anglicans, Anabaptists. Each group is claiming absolute truth, and crucially, this is the big part, each group is securing local political backing in their different regions. The old pattern returns with a vengeance. Absolute belief combined with local political authority creates immense pressure. And eventually, that pressure violently breaks. The city of Münster is a chilling eruption of that exact pressure. A radical group actually takes control of the city, declares it a new Jerusalem, and forcibly expels anyone who disagrees. What happens next is just astonishing. Enemies who would normally bitterly oppose each other decide to unite. A Catholic bishop and a Lutheran prince form one single army, lay one massive siege, and absolutely crush the city over 16 months. It ends brutally. We're talking executions, public displays, and iron cages hung from the main church tower. Cages that, incredibly, are actually still hanging there today. But Münster is just one isolated case, right? Unfortunately, no. This core formula, difference in belief plus access to state power, multiplied violently across the entire European continent. England shifted back and forth between Catholic and Protestant rule, with each shift bringing new waves of executions. Germany descended into the Peasants' War, leaving hundreds of thousands dead. Violence basically filled the space between belief and power everywhere you looked. In France, they really tried to stabilize the violence. There is this fragile peace, marked by a massive royal wedding. Huguenot leaders, those are the Protestants, arrive in Paris totally unarmed, trusting the agreement. But an assassination attempt fails, and behind the scenes, cold political calculation takes over. On August 24, 1572, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre begins. A gesture of trust is completely weaponized. Militias move through Paris with literal lists of names and streets. It is systematic, and the violence spreads from Paris across France for weeks. 3 million dead. The ensuing French wars of religion absolutely decimated the population. In Rome, the massacre was actually celebrated, but in Protestant Europe, it shattered trust permanently. The wars raged on for decades, claiming millions of lives. But incredibly, amazingly, this still wasn't the absolute peak of the devastation. Over in Central Europe in 1618, a highly localized religious dispute escalates into something entirely uncontainable. We know it as the 30 Years' War. It rapidly draws in France, Spain, Sweden, Denmark, and all these German states. A local argument over belief literally consumed a continent, erasing entire villages from existence. 8 million. That is the death toll of the 30 Years' War over 3 decades. 8 million soldiers and civilians alike. Entire regions of Europe were simply emptied out. It is the absolute peak of this historical tragedy. And when it finally ends in 1648, there is no grand victory for anyone. There is only total system-wide exhaustion. Negotiators finally sat down to stop the world from collapsing any further, producing what we call the Peace of Westphalia. This was a defining agreement that states would no longer interfere in each other's internal religious affairs. And historians point to this exact moment as the foundation of modern state sovereignty. But, and this is key, it wasn't born from some high-minded philosophy. They weren't sitting there trying to design an ideal utopian world. So the crucial point is, modern sovereignty was created simply by shrinking the state's power over belief. They had to separate the two because the combination was just too volatile to survive, which leaves us with this final haunting formula, derived from 13 centuries of history. Absolute belief plus absolute power equals collapse. If you put those two things in the exact same system, the historical record shows us exactly what happens every single time. It really doesn't matter what the original teachings of a movement were. When belief gains the power of the sword, the cycle of persecution becomes inevitable. So, looking at our own modern structures of power and ideology today, Have we truly learned the lesson of Westphalia, or are we just waiting for this cycle to begin all over again?